Before we truly see the shape of Gothmog, we must first listen to the whisper of fire that underpinned all of it, where the first chords of creation trembled and unfolded. In those earliest moments before mountains rose or seas settled, there was only the music of the Aenor, vibrating through a void of unshaped possibility. It was in this primordial resonance that discord first entered the weave, a shadow of ambition, a longing for dominion, a quiet insistence that some notes bend toward self. Among those drawn to that dark call were the spirits that would later serve Morgoth, their forms yet unshaped, their purpose malleable, their power immense but undefined. In the burning halls of Angband, those centuries would pass before they took tangible shape in the world. The seeds of fear and order were sown. Fire moved not merely as a weapon, but as an echo of intent, a tool to shape will as much as landscape. It is within this principle that Gothmog's essence was first conceived, not simply a creature of flame, but an agent of consequence, bound in service yet aware of his own might. To grasp this, we must sense the rhythm of power and restraint, the delicate tension between obedience and freedom. Even the mightiest in these early whispers were already measured against the weight of unseen mandates. These were not fires of destruction in the ordinary sense, but currents of transformation, laying the foundation for what Ada would remember and fear. Each spark contained potential, and each shadow hinted at loss, for every act of creation carried an echo of ruin. Within the molten depths of Angband, visions of distant lands, rivers of light and shadow, and cities of stone and steel flickered in the minds of those drawn to Morgoth's design. There, in the crucible of thought and energy, the Balrogs took their first tentative shape, figures of immense stature and terrible beauty, wreathed in flame and shadow alike. Even before the first battle, the name of Gothmog was a promise whispered among the host of Angband, a token of dread that suggested discipline and unrestrained fury in equal measure. Yet his destiny was never to be immediate, for the ways of power are slow, deliberate, and measured against cosmic currents beyond comprehension. The mechanisms of authority, of hierarchy, of mandate and subordination were already in place. Each Maiar who bent to Morgoth's will understood, if only dimly, that to serve such a master is both elevation and burden. One's might magnified, yet forever tethered to a shadow larger than the self. In these earliest visions, fire did not merely burn, it demanded recognition. It was a medium of promise and of warning. Structures, both material and metaphysical, were forged in correspondence. Vaulted halls of shadowed stone, forges where molten rivers ran like veins of energy, and corridors in which the echo of footsteps alone could instill fear. All of these would become familiar as Angband rose from the earth, yet in these first flickerings they existed as patterns, as possibilities, as whispers of inevitability. It is here, amidst the elemental and the eternal, that the listener begins to sense Gothmog, not only as a figure of war, but as a manifestation of principle, the unrelenting cost of obedience to a cosmic force, the tension between innate strength and imposed duty, the inevitability that greatness carries both terror and consequence. These threads are first laid in the molten quiet, in the hush before the storms of Middle-earth, and they will follow the Balrog across centuries of legend and battle, ever evolving, ever demanding attention. And yet, even in this crucible, a question lingers. How does such a being, born of flame and bound to a greater mandate, come to wield its power? What does it cost to exist at the edge of creation, to embody both awe and dread, and to act within the weave of destiny without losing oneself entirely? These are the currents we will follow, gently tracing their path as they harden into form, as the first steps of the Lieutenant of Angband take shape. Before the fire solidifies into legend, before the echoes of Gondolin and the cries of elven warriors are heard, we stand at the edge of inception, listening to the rhythm of flame itself, feeling the slow unfolding of consequence. In the stillness we understand that this is the beginning, the fires of Arir, where the music of the Ainur met the shadow of ambition, and where the first whisper of Gothmog stirred within the molten heart of Angband. The molten silence of Angband deepened, and in that silence Gothmog grew, not in size, for he had always been vast, but in role, in function, in the precise tempering of terror into authority. His presence was no longer merely whispered among the spirits of flame. It had begun to take weight among the corridors of command, where Morgoth shaped his designs into action. Not all who served the Dark Lord were equal, and the hierarchy of dread had begun to crystallize. Among the Balrogs it was Gothmog who stood tallest, not by arbitrary favor, but by the way his presence stilled argument and focused fear into clarity. He was the lieutenant of Angband. The title was not spoken in ceremony, for Morgoth did not bestow ranks in the manner of kings. It was forged in necessity. Whenever a host of ruin was to be gathered, it was Gothmog who marshaled them. Whenever a breach of will threatened to fracture the Dark Legions, it was Gothmog's voice, low and flame-wreathed, that brought the line back into order. To command in Morgoth's name required more than power. It demanded containment, calculation, and above all the ability to act without questioning the mandate that gave him shape. He did not advise. That role fell to others, to Sauron, who trafficked in words and mechanisms, and to lesser lieutenants who plotted movements in shadows. Gothmog was the will made manifest. His decisions were not recorded, but etched in the smoldering scars of Middle-earth. A fortress ruined, a forest blackened, a warrior's line ended. He spoke less than most, but every movement carried implication. He was not Morgoth's favorite, nor his confidant, but he was the one Morgoth trusted to break the world when other measures failed. It is here that the architecture of Angband deserves quiet attention. Beneath the earth's crust, its galleries and vaults were not only of stone and flame, but of hierarchy. The deeper one traveled, the fewer voices were heard. In the upper halls, orcs bickered and captains sharpened their blades. But deeper still, there were places where silence reigned, not by rule but by awe. It was in one of these halls, half lit by slow-burning pits, that Gothmog paced like a thought solidified. He walked, not alone. Around him, lesser Balrogs gathered, not as comrades, but as instruments awaiting command. They did not need explanation. The way he halted before a vast stone table, carved with the outlines of Beleriand's mountain spines and forest veins, was instruction enough. He pointed once, and a finger of fire traced a path from the farthest north to the river crossings where elven scouts were rumored to gather. He did not name the operation. He did not speak of strategy. He only looked, and the lieutenants bowed their heads as though his silence had pressed them into the very stone. Still, there were murmurs beyond the flame. Among the orc bands and goblin captains, rumors stirred that the lieutenant had never been wounded, that he could walk through rivers without steam rising, that he did not sleep, did not eat, did not speak unless Morgoth required it. Such myths were born not from myth-making, but from absence, for Gothmog did not linger. When his work was done, he vanished into the depths, leaving only heat and collapse in his wake. Yet even he was bound. Though vast in might and feared by all who glimpsed his shadow across a ridgeline, Gothmog moved only as Morgoth desired, and Morgoth's will was not always stable. It swelled with ambition, contracted with caution, and pulsed with moods none dared question. Gothmog did not resist these shifts. He accepted them, as fire accepts the shape of the forge. But within that obedience, there was a clarity he never voiced. that the loyalty he bore was not love, nor belief, but function. He had been made for a purpose, and until that purpose frayed, he would serve it completely. This too is where power quietly revealed its cost. For in times of stillness, when no fortress called for ruin, when no host required dread, it was not peace that Gothmog inhabited. It was vacancy. The waiting hollowed him. Without command there was no motion, without battle there was no meaning, and though he burned with the fire of ancient creation, he was not free to choose where it spread. Angband never slept, but it often waited. In one such lull, with warships idling and scouts withdrawn, Gothmog stood before a sealed vault. Within lay weapons not yet named, relics too costly to use. He did not open it. He only stood watching the patterns of flame curl along its edges, as though listening for a summons that had not yet arrived. And when at last footsteps echoed down the long corridor behind him, messengers bearing Morgoth's will, he turned not with eagerness but with the silent acceptance of one who already knew that fire, once kindled, must move forward. Now that his shape had solidified and his title was spoken in hushed breath even among allies, the question emerges not of who Gothmog was, but what he would become when loosed upon the world beyond stone. What would happen when flame met resistance, and the lieutenant of Angband stepped beyond the forge of purpose into the field of war? When Gothmog first crossed the thresholds of the world beyond Angband, the air itself seemed to recoil. The siege of Gondolin would mark his true arrival into the remembered fabric of Middle-earth, not as a name whispered within darkened halls, but as a force carved into the flesh of cities and the bones of legends. It was not the first battle he had led, nor the last, but it was here beneath the high white towers and the hidden passes of that concealed realm that the shape of his power met resistance worthy of its fury. Gondolin had been a secret walled not only by stone and cliff, but by hope, song, and the stubborn craft of the Noldor. It was a city born from memory and exile, meant to outlast the shadow Morgoth cast across Beleriand. Yet shadows always move toward light, and from the moment a single scout glimpsed the glint of its domes beneath the encircling mountains, the city's end had already begun to smolder. Gothmog did not arrive as a harbinger. He did not stand upon ridges or send forth heralds. He descended. With him came fire drakes, iron serpents with molten breath, and legions shaped from darkened flame. Balrogs flanked him, their whips hissing like breath through stone. But it was Gothmog alone who carried stillness before the assault, a moment of pause before annihilation. Like the breathless hush before a forge is struck, he made no speech, he gave no signal. When the siege began, it did so with terrifying clarity, as if the earth itself had agreed to open. Walls melted, towers cracked from within. Even the hidden gate, once thought unreachable, was wreathed in smoke and doubt. The mechanisms of ruin were simple: fire, pressure, confusion, but their execution was precise. Gothmog had studied the rhythm of elven defense, their elegance, their tendency toward order, and he brought only entropy. Yet Gondolin did not fall at once. From its spires came warriors who did not cower, who sang as they fought. One among them, Ecthelion of the Fountain, met Gothmog not as an equal in strength, but in will. Their clash was not one of strategy but of essence, flame against clarity, fury against defiance. They met in the city's heart, where the fountains still poured silver water, despite the ash. Gothmog, towering and seething, struck with a force that shattered marble, but Ecthelion moved with poise untouched by fear. The duel was not long, but it was seared into the memory of all who survived. In the end both fell, the flame drowned in water, the fountain shattered by flame. Here lies a quiet paradox. In victory, Gothmog was lost. Gondolin burned, its people scattered, but its destruction came at the cost of the very fire that consumed it. The lieutenant of Angband had fulfilled his purpose. Yet what was left of him in the ash? Was he diminished? Had his form been unmade? Or was he merely withdrawn, retreating back into the molten halls to reforge what had been spent? The legends do not agree, and Morgoth did not speak of it. Still, Gondolin's fall reshaped the war. Fear spread faster than fire. The hidden realms once thought beyond the reach of Angband's hand now trembled with uncertainty. The elves spoke of Gothmog not as a warrior, but as a shadow from which no stronghold could hide. The very earth beneath their sanctuaries now seemed porous, vulnerable. And yet, this chapter of ruin reveals more than the power of destruction. It shows the price embedded in every blow. Gondolin's fall was not a simple victory. It was a trade. A warrior spent, a legend wounded, a city lost not to madness or surprise, but to inevitability. The symmetry of that battle, its precision, its devastation, its final silence, would echo through every campaign that followed. In the aftermath, Angband did not rejoice. There were no songs in its forges, no banners raised. The fire that had moved so far to extinguish light now smoldered inward. Morgoth spoke little of Gothmog in the days that followed, though his presence was still felt, like heat beneath stone, waiting, gathering, coiling around new shapes of war. Now we must ask, when a being of such magnitude is spent, what becomes of him? Is the fire lessened or merely deepened? And what form does wrath take when it returns from near destruction, bearing not just flame but memory? For Gothmog's story does not end in Gondolin's ruin. It coils outward, into the fear of Beleriand, into the silence of councils and the restless tremors beneath unbroken ground. Something had shifted, and the world, though not yet ready to name it, had already begun to fear what would come next. Long after the towers of Gondolin had fallen into ash and memory, the fear that Gothmog inspired did not fade. It spread across the rolling hills of Beleriand, through the whispering forests and deep-carved river valleys. A shadow moved ahead of him. He was no longer a creature of flame alone, but of rumor, legend, and the tightening of breath before twilight fell. Among the elves, his name became a silence. In the halls of men it was spoken only in low tones, paired with curses or half-remembered prayers. No longer was Gothmog merely the lieutenant of Angband. He had become its herald. His presence did not require battles to burn villages or topple stone. His presence changed the way people slept, the way they listened for cracks in the earth, the way they stared into campfires and wondered if the flame might answer back. The landscape of Beleriand began to mirror this dread. Where once there had been clear paths and marked borders, now there was only hesitation. Travelers avoided valleys where no wind blew. Rangers returned from patrol, speaking of sudden warmth in the air, of stones that burned to the touch, of great shapes glimpsed beyond mist. Fear does not always arrive with horns and banners. It settles into the bones of a region, and then into its politics. Elven lords convened in hastily built courts, voices rising over maps and supply scrolls. Their scouts brought back drawings of strange symbols burned into tree bark, of blackened soil where no fire had passed. They spoke of sightings, fleeting, far off, but always accompanied by silence in the birdsong and the faint taste of ash on the wind. And though many dismissed these as illusions of war-wearied minds, none dismissed the implication. Gondolin had fallen. If even the hidden city could not hold, what remained that might? Thus the geography have shifted. Hithlum, once a contested stronghold, now sat in quiet dread beneath a sky that never cleared. In the eastern marches, warriors began training by night, so that they might face fire without flinching. Forests such as Dorthonion grew darker, thicker, more aware of the fires that might one day come for them. Strategic routes were reconsidered. Strongholds were relocated or abandoned altogether, not by decree but by instinct, as though the land itself understood the path Gothmog might take, and stepped back to let it pass. In these movements, no sword had yet been drawn. This was influence without violence, terror as architecture. And still Gothmog did not act. He waited. Somewhere within the deeper caverns of Angband, he prepared not as a general makes ready for war, but as a storm shapes itself in silence before it breaks. Those who glimpsed him in those years, few as they were, spoke of a chain. His flame burned lower, but deeper, like coals that hold their breath before a forge is struck anew. Some whispered that he mourned the duel with Ecthelion, that he had not expected resistance to carve so cleanly through fury. Others said his silence was a sign of greater planning, that Morgoth had given him new charge, not simply to destroy, but to unravel. He would not merely burn cities, he would make them doubt the ground they stood on. The creatures beneath him followed suit. The Balrogs grew more precise, their assaults more measured. Orcish raids were no longer chaotic, but coordinated, designed to pull defenders away from real targets. The very style of Angband's war shifted, as though the logic of fire had learned to wait, to bend around stone rather than shatter it outright. Gothmog was not merely adapting, he was teaching, and so the world adjusted. Kings set new scouts along mountain passes, river crossings were reinforced with enchantments older than memory. But none of it stilled the unease. For how does one guard against a presence that may not arrive with troops but with the air itself? How does one defend against a silence that tightens the chest, or a heat that seeps up through stone long before a single flame is seen? Even Morgoth, in his iron throne deep beneath the world, began to speak of new designs, of pushing the fear of Gothmog ahead of his armies, so that battle need not even be joined. He called it a slow conquest, and it worked. Small outposts capitulated without a fight, villages emptied by rumor alone. Messengers abandoned their roads, claiming the trees themselves whispered of fire. And yet, amid this expanding dread, a question burned at the edge of every council. Had Gothmog changed, or had the world simply learned to fear him properly? For he had not raised his whip in years, and still the war bent around him. Perhaps it was not absence that defined him now, but anticipation. Perhaps the greatest terror was not what Gothmog had done, but what he had not yet begun. The fires that had once consumed Gondolin now lingered only in story and soot, but the land had not forgotten. For every ruin left smoldering in Gothmog's wake, a silence bloomed, an absence shaped not by retreat, but by deliberate withdrawal. He had not fallen in the fountains, as some believed. He had returned to Angband whole, but changed. He carried the memory of resistance. He carried the weight of what it meant to destroy something beautiful and be altered by the act. And so, in the long shadows that stretched between battles, Gothmog chose not to roar, but to watch. From the deep towers of Angband, he studied the patterns of elven defense, how they reformed after collapse, how they shifted their alliances and thickened their borders like scar tissue. He did not strike blindly. His movements now were calculated, deliberate, like a blade set against fabric, not to slice at once, but to test where it would tear most cleanly. In this stillness came a new kind of war, one not marked by the clash of armies, but by singular ends. Captains disappeared, messengers never arrived. Fires were seen in the hills, and by morning, villages lay cold and abandoned. Gothmog's hand was rarely seen, but his influence moved through the cracks of Middle-earth. finding those whose deaths would tilt the balance. It was in this manner that the first great heroes of the Western Front began to fall, not by glory, not by duel, but by erosion. Firmun was among them, High King of the Noldor. Proud and fair-minded, he had stood tall through the bitter turning of seasons. His people had looked to him not for miracles, but for endurance. Yet endurance, too, has its limit. In the haze before dawn on the fields of Hithlum, Gothmog came not as a storm, but as a certainty. They met upon the rise of Ithel Sirion, where once a watchtower had stood, and now only broken stone remained. Fingon stood with his captains, unaware that his fate had already entered history. It is said Gothmog waited until the mist was thin enough for his shape to be seen, but thick enough to dull the cries that followed. The duel was swift, brutal, inevitable. No song was composed to remember it, only the silence that followed. Fingon fell beneath Gothmog's hammer. His helm split, his body burned beyond the rites of burial. In that moment the fire did not merely consume the king. It unraveled a lineage, a rallying point, a symbol, and it did so without spectacle. There were no horns, no declarations. The flame moved through, and what remained was ash. But even that was not without cost. The smoke that rose from the death of Fingon curled into the sky and was seen by many. Not all fled. Some held their ground. Some remembered Gondolin's fall and chose to meet the shadow differently. The death of a king is never clean. It awakens things. Thus came the twilight days, when loss gathered not in floods, but in steady accumulation. Elf lords once mighty were worn down by attrition. Dwarves sealed their halls with stone and iron, trusting fire would pass them by. Men looked eastward with haunted eyes, unsure where loyalty would protect them, and where it would draw the flame. And all the while Gothmog's fire burned low, coiled and watching. It would be easy to see these days as victory. Cities bowed, roads crumbled, maps were redrawn in soot. But deep within Angband, even Gothmog must have felt the cost. Power, when wielded often, grows heavier. The weight of command, the rituals of war, the endless cycle of rise and fall. It burns, not only outward, but inward. He had become the judge of strength, the breaker of resolve, but he had also become isolated by it. There were no equals left to test him, no counterforce to measure against, only a world slowly giving way. And yet, something stirred in the south. Elven hosts were gathering. New banners had begun to rise, not of defiance alone, but of unity. Whispers reached even the depths of Angband, Gil-galad, Elendil, names spoken with caution, but not fear. Something in the tone had changed. Gothmog listened. He did not rush to meet them. Fire knows how to wait. It does not chase, it consumes what comes to it. But in that waiting, a thought began to form. What would happen if the flame were tested again, not by city walls or fleeting warriors, but by something patient, something equally forged by loss? He did not ask this question aloud. He did not confide in Morgoth, nor in the Balrogs that still lingered by the forges. But the thought remained, like a coal buried beneath stone, quiet, glowing, unresolved. And as his gaze turned south, to a horizon not yet blackened, the land seemed to brace itself once more, not for what Gothmog had done, but for what he might still be capable of when the fire rose again. In the vaulted chambers beneath Angband, where fire did not flicker, but rolled in silent sheets across basalt walls, the air began to thicken with the scent of counsel. It was a rare thing in those deep dominions, not because Morgoth lacked voices to call upon, but because he trusted so few. Command was not shared, it was dispensed, like molten iron poured into mold. And yet when the edges of the war began to blur, When the old strategies no longer yielded swift ruin, Morgoth summoned his inner circle to speak in shadow. Gothmog entered the council chamber without ceremony. He did not bow. He had long passed the need for gestures. Around him gathered others, wraith-like, adorned with sigils of broken stars and masks of darkened bronze. There was Sauron, seated where the flame did not reach, his voice coiled and precise, and lesser lieutenants, whose names would be lost in time, but whose whispers had steered raids and betrayals across centuries. They gathered not in defiance of unity, but because even dread must be coordinated. The war had changed. Resistance had not vanished. It had adapted. The elves had begun to move with unpredictability, binding their magic with new patterns, abandoning strongholds before siege lines even formed. The Free Peoples were learning, not to match Angband in power, but to elude it, to wear it down. Gothmog stood before the war table, its surface carved with the ridgelines of Beleriand, its rivers cast in thin channels of silver, now tarnished and dark. He did not speak first. It was not his way. He waited, while Morgoth's voice unfurled from the far side of the room like smoke from a vented chasm. "There is a fracture," Morgoth said, eyes distant, not looking at any one of them. "Not among our enemies, but among us. We act in fragments. We press without shape. That cannot continue." Sauron, always eager to thread doubt into strength, offered his vision: more control over the Orc legions, closer surveillance of the southern passes, a system of hidden wayposts to track movements beyond their reach. He spoke of patterns and probabilities, of calculated incursions, of rings of pressure applied where elven will was weakest. But Gothmog remained still. He did not speak until the others had exhausted their diagrams and projections. And when at last he raised his hand, a hand shaped like a blade cloaked in heat, he pointed to a single space on the map, the marches of Dorthonion. "There," he said. Just one word, but the tone was like the crack of obsidian splitting. There, where the forests twisted up into the northern slopes, where light dimmed even in summer, and where the last vestiges of the old resistance still clung to their fading banners. It was a place neither fortified nor forgotten, a seam in the land's fabric, easily torn and easily ignored. But Gothmog did not ignore it. He understood pressure differently. Where others saw targets, he saw hinges. His plan was not one of sweeping conquest. It was surgical, a single deployment, a piercing strike to crush morale, not with numbers but with precision. The goal was not to burn Dorthonion, it was to unmake its will. Morgoth nodded once. No further blessing was needed. The lieutenant of Angband had spoken. In the days that followed, the preparation was quiet. There were no parades, no chants, only the sound of iron meeting flesh as weapons were tested, and the low tremor of Balrog feet as they moved into formation. Gothmog did not lead from behind. He moved first, always, and when he reached the borders of Dorthonion, he did not bring with him the great storms of flame that had melted the gates of Gondolin. He brought silence. He brought cold flame, compressed fury, a heat that did not glow but devoured. The forest began to rot from the roots up, leaves blackening not from fire but from despair. The defenders were few, but proud. They had not expected Angband's eye to fall upon them. Their captain, a young elf who had never seen a Balrog before, stood atop a narrow ridge and watched as the darkness approached, not as a cloud, but as a shape with eyes like embers buried beneath ancient stone. The battle lasted no more than an hour. There was no collapse, no rout, only stillness, and then nothing. When word returned, what little of it remained, it was not brought by survivors, but by birds who no longer flew over the forest canopy. Dorthonion had gone quiet. Back in Angband, the council did not reconvene. It did not need to. The message had been delivered not in language, but in absence. Morgoth understood. The fire had not grown louder. It had grown more precise. But even in that victory, a tension remained. For Gothmog had shown them what it meant to move alone, to strike without command, to act not merely as a servant but as a force unto himself. And forces, when left unchecked, do not remain still for long. The ground beneath Ardgalen cracked long before the first sword was drawn. Deep fissures ran like veins across the scorched plain, exhaling slow breath from a world that had forgotten softness. It was here, upon this wide and haunted expanse, that the flame would rise again. Not in stealth this time, but with the full force of declaration. Dagor Bragolak. The battle of sudden flame. Gothmog did not descend as a secret. He came as signal. Fire, long held, must one day move, from the black gate of Angband to the distant outposts of Elven command. The world trembled with the sound of heat uncoiling. The frost of winter had not yet broken, and yet the snow melted overnight. Rivers ran too high. Smoke curled from places untouched by torch. The season itself recoiled. Morgoth had long prepared for this unleashing, and Gothmog was its blade. The Balrogs marched in a great arc, each a moving wound in the fabric of the north. But Gothmog did not march at their center. He moved at the edge of formation, watching the lines between resistance and collapse, measuring which cracks would spread when struck. He was not reckless. Fire must be shaped if it is to endure. When the assault began, it did so with no warning. Great fountains of flame erupted from beneath the plain, turning earth into kindling, fortresses thought invulnerable. Barad Aethel, Himring, Agron were suddenly islands in a tide of heat. Orcs followed, not in waves, but in strands, like smoke searching for weakness. The defenders reeled. Fingolfin, proud and solemn, held his command in the west, his eyes turned toward the burning east. Mestros, returned from torment, tried to rally the scattered houses of his kin, but neither could stem the fire. It moved without pattern, without mercy, a consciousness unfolding in destruction. Gothmog moved through it all like a general and a flame. He did not bellow commands. He pressed pressure into space. At the fortress of Aethel Sirion, he appeared not at the gate, but within, carried through secret vents of fire long forgotten. A captain of men turned just in time to see a shadowed figure step from a vent of steam, eyes burning, whip unfurling like a serpent of light. There were no survivors in that wing of the keep. Yet Gothmog did not linger. He was not there to conquer every room. He was there to break the rhythm of defense. He left gaps, ruin, uncertainty, and then vanished again into the flame. This was his mastery, not destruction alone, but disruption. He knew that battles were not always won by numbers, but by confusion, by erosion of trust in the very walls around you. By the seventh day of the battle, Angband's forces had pierced deep into the realms of the Noldor. Strongholds fell, leaders were isolated, alliances frayed, and though Morgoth's name was invoked in every report, it was Gothmog's presence that haunted the most. Stories spread of a warrior cloaked in silence, who struck and disappeared, whose footsteps melted the flagstones beneath him. The elves began to dread not the siege itself, but the possibility that Gothmog had entered their fortress without their knowing. And yet even in the fire, there were moments of resistance. At the high ridge of Dorthonion's edge, a battalion of Sindar archers held a pass for 3 days longer than any scout had predicted. Their arrows, soaked in river oil, burned brighter than the skies. Their captain, a woman whose name would not be remembered in songs, faced Gothmog alone as her line fell around her. She did not speak. She only stood, arrow nocked, even as his whip cleaved the stone at her feet. He stopped briefly, not out of mercy but out of recognition. Defiance was a shape he understood, and then he moved through her like wind through flame. The pass fell, but the pause remained, and with it a memory, one that would rise again later, though he did not yet know where. Dagor did not end in triumph. It ended in smolder. The fire, though vast, could not consume everything. The elves did not collapse. They adapted. The lines redrew. Retreat became strategy. What was meant to be annihilation became transformation. The world did not burn all at once. And Gothmog, though unbroken, returned to Angband with less certainty than he had carried before. Victory had come, but not as cleanly as it once had. The fire had moved outward, but it had met resistance that did not die. It changed. He entered the great forges not to rest, but to listen. The silence of metal cooling, the shift in wind through the upper vents, and beneath it all the knowledge that next time, when the fire rose again, it would not be surprise that won the day. It would be endurance. In the uneasy silence after Dagor Bragolak, the land did not rejoice, nor did it mourn. It held its breath. The northern skies remained dim, not from storm, but from lingering smoke that refused to rise or scatter. And within that ashen stillness Gothmog did not return to war. He withdrew, not as a retreat, but as a coiling. He vanished from the field like a fire swept under stone, waiting for breath, for purpose, for the next moment of ignition. But Middle-earth remembered. His name had passed beyond the mouths of soldiers and kings and into the pulse of the land itself. Mothers taught children to avoid the northern roads, not because of beasts, but because he might pass that way. Hunters carried talismans, not against wolves, but against flame. The fear he seeded no longer needed his presence to take root. Gothmog had become myth while still alive, a creature half invoked and half expected, like thunder before the storm breaks. Yet for Gothmog, the pause was not peace. It was weight, the slow, inescapable compression of legend upon the one who bore it. Each time he emerged, he was more than before, more than fire, more than shadow, more than a lieutenant. And with each emergence he paid in something unseen. Stillness became harder to bear, and silence no longer restored. He had become a weapon, and weapons are not made to sleep. Within Angband's lower halls, where the magma did not glow but hummed like a heart beneath the world, Gothmog paced alone. The other Balrogs had learned to move around him not out of fear, but out of recognition. He had begun to shift not in shape but in rhythm. His fury no longer flickered with impulse. It built slowly, deliberately, with the patience of something that had seen the world break and knew it would break again. From time to time he would ascend the inner ramparts of Angband and watch the plains, not with curiosity, with measurement. The world, it seemed, was reordering itself. Morgoth had pulled back, the great assaults had stilled, and the elves, those who had survived the fire, were not rebuilding their towers. They were changing. Their lines became mobile, their alliances fluid, and men, once scattered and vulnerable, had begun to forge their own strength in the south. New banners rose, new eyes turned north. Gothmog watched them not with contempt but with something quieter, a long recognition. Fire did not hate what it burned. It simply consumed. But what now was left to consume that would not simply vanish in the act? It was in this quiet that memories stirred. He remembered Ecthelion, and how the fountains had hissed when flame met water. He remembered Fingon's body, burned beyond mourning. He remembered the captain on Dorthonion's edge who had raised her arrow and stood her ground until the end. These were not regrets, but they lingered, because with each memory came a question. Had he ended them, or had they, in their final defiance, defined him more than he had undone them? The forge is not only a place of creation, it is also where weapons crack, where old blades are melted down and reforged. Gothmog stood now in such a state, not broken, but close to something he did not yet recognize. He had followed command, fulfilled duty, embodied terror, and yet, in the absence of flame, he felt no peace, only repetition. Word reached Angband in fragments. Small skirmishes lost to elves who had learned to vanish into forest and fog, dwarves closing roads to the north, men preparing rituals not of war but of remembrance. Resistance had not ended, it had evolved. The flame had not scared it into hiding, it had taught it to survive. And so Gothmog waited, but it was not idleness. It was the waiting of a furnace banked low, of embers feeding on their own memory. Something would come. It always did, and when it did, he would move, not out of rage, not out of obedience, but because it was what he was. He stood once more before the stone map, now cracked from heat and wear. His hand hovered above a region in the south, not yet aflame, not yet drawn into the war's full shadow. The names were unfamiliar to him: Elendil, Gil-galad, Isildur. But names were not what mattered. What mattered was what they would become in fire. And somewhere beyond the mountains, beyond the smoke-worn horizon, the world stirred again. A gathering force, a final resistance not yet born. And in the silence before that storm, Gothmog waited, not to strike first, but to be the last fire they could not forget. The forges of Angband had cooled, but only slightly. Embers still pulsed beneath their vast plates, slow as breath, ancient as betrayal. Gothmog stood motionless before the dark mouth of a stone vent, not to command but to endure. It was here, in the near silence, that the burden began to press, not from failure, not even from doubt, but from the slow erosion that comes when a purpose repeats too long without transformation. He was not diminished in might. No edge of his flame had dulled, no scar marked his flesh, but something within him, deep, slow burning, had shifted. The victories no longer carved meaning into the world. The world absorbed them, adjusted, continued. The elves no longer fled at the mere rumor of his presence. They braced, adapted, built anew. Each conquest now demanded more, and each left him less. Fire had always been the symbol of wrath, but in Gothmog it had become discipline. He no longer moved with the impulse of destruction. He moved with weight. Every appearance became a choice, every battle a sentence spoken with care. For the cost of power, unrelenting and unshared, is not weariness, it is containment. A fire that cannot stop must be chained, or it consumes even its own flame. In the absence of orders, he began to walk the tunnels of Angband alone. No torch was needed. The darkness parted before him, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. The walls themselves had shaped around his passing over the centuries, curving subtly toward the path he most often chose. And in this solitary procession, memory returned, not as vision, but as sensation. He remembered the sound of Ecthelion's armor breaking in water, the feel of Fingon's final resistance, like iron wrapped in light. He remembered not their faces, but the way their will had struck him, not in body but in rhythm, for even a being of fire can feel when another spirit resists not with force, but with meaning. And meaning, once sensed, cannot be unlearned. That was the weight now, not guilt, not remorse, but recognition. These were not simple extinguishings, they were transactions. Each soul ended, had left something behind in him, a fragment of defiance preserved in flame. Over time, these fragments did not fade. They gathered. What was Gothmog now? Not merely lieutenant, not merely executioner. He had become the echo chamber of all he had ended. And in the silence between wars, those echoes stirred, not in speech, but in presence. They did not haunt, they waited. As he waited, then came the whisper of new alliances. From the south, across rivers not yet blackened, came word of a gathering, men and elves, forging a unity long thought impossible. Gil-galad, Elendil, names that, like Fingon before them, carried a steadiness not easily broken. This was no scattered resistance. This was momentum. Gothmog did not fear them, but he recognized the shape of what they formed. He had seen it before in smaller patterns. A line that would not yield, a tower that would not burn, a hand that reached toward light even as it burned. Such shapes did not fall easily. They had to be unwound from within. He returned to the council chamber, not at Morgoth's summons, but of his own will. The chamber was colder now. The fire pits had dimmed. Morgoth had grown silent, his designs deeper, stranger. Sauron spoke in his place more often now, but Gothmog did not speak to him. He placed a gauntleted hand upon the edge of the war table, blackened by centuries, and stared at a blank space in the south. "We go again," he said. No flourish, no command, just the shape of inevitability. No one objected. The others understood. When Gothmog moved, the world followed, whether in flame or fear or both. And yet, as he turned from the chamber and descended the long slope toward the staging vaults, a question traced the edge of his mind. Not from doubt, from necessity. What would happen if this final war was not victory, but reflection? If what waited at the end of fire was not ruin, but a mirror? He did not know, but he would go. Fire does not retreat. It rolls forward, carrying all that it has consumed. In the depths of Angband, the armories opened. Whips recoiled. Armor was pulled from the racks like old vows reawakened. And far beyond, in lands not yet scorched, a child looked northward and felt a warmth that had no wind behind it. The old fear stirred again, but this time it would not be rumor. It would have form. The southern winds carried no scent of fire, but the land felt it coming. From the mountains of Eredwithrin to the shores of Belfalas, the people of Middle-earth turned their eyes northward. Smoke had not yet blackened their skies, nor had the ground split with heat, but the air moved strangely, as if bracing itself. Gothmog did not lead an army across the plains. He was not a herald of drums and banners. He moved in currents, subtle preparations that rippled outward through the ranks of Morgoth's host. The forges of Angband roared back to life. Molten streams cast into new weapons, shaped for prolonged war. Orders were sent not in ink, but in flame, whispered through the corridors of the earth. This would not be a siege in the old sense. It would be a pressure without center, a slow closing of a vast hand. For Morgoth, this was the long game. The age was bending. He saw beyond the next battle. But Gothmog saw something else. His mind did not linger on dominion or rule. He looked toward the south with a warrior's weight, drawn not by conquest but by the growing certainty of reckoning. Elendil, Gil-galad. The names surfaced again and again in the reports carried by spies and twisted birds. Men and elves, once sundered by language and blood, now stood together, gathering their strength in a union so improbable that even Sauron whispered of it with caution. The last alliance, they called it, though none yet knew how final it would be. It was not the size of this alliance that stirred the fire in Gothmog. It was the nature of it. He had seen alliances before, They frayed at the edges, burned from within, undone by mistrust and exhaustion. But this one did not fray. It coalesced. It moved like an answer to every shadow he had cast. And that, more than any sword or fortress, gave it shape. Scouts reported not only soldiers gathering, but rituals, men anointing their blades in sacred rivers, elves weaving song into armor, dwarves, silent but present, lending steel and silence. These were not mere hosts. They were stories converging, and for the first time in an age, Gothmog felt the land resist, not just in arms but in memory. Still, he did not hesitate. War was not a thing to fear. It was the air he breathed. He had been made for this convergence, though none had spoken it aloud. While Morgoth plotted the corruption of hearts and Sauron laid snares of spirit, Gothmog prepared for fire. The roads leading south became corridors of motion. Beasts bred for siege were unchained. Iron-bound catapults, silent for decades, were dragged from storage. Balrogs moved in formation, not as individuals, but as limbs of a single wrath. The host of Angband did not descend like a storm. It expanded like a horizon of inevitability. And still, Gothmog said little. He stood beneath the ancient arch of Dungortheb's edge, watching the glow of the stars begin to dim under the dust of war's approach. His eyes turned once to the west, toward the ruined lands of Dorthonion, where memories still lingered like smoke, then south, toward where the Alliance gathered. He did not hope, he did not dread, but he understood. This battle would not be like those that came before. This would be no siege with a single gate to breach. It would be a meeting of old fire and new resolve, and it would not be settled quickly. In his silence, preparations were complete. The hammer was retempered, his whip reforged with threads of iron and shadow, no longer snapped in practice, but hummed with anticipation. And when at last the word came, carried by Morgoth himself, not through words but through will, Gothmog did not answer with voice. He stepped forward. The long march began not with shouting but with silence, a silence so vast it echoed through the bones of the land. To the south, the last alliance began to fortify, not behind walls, but in unity. Camps spread across Dagorlad. Standards of the 7 stars rose beside the trees of Valinor. Fires were lit not out of fear, but remembrance. Their songs were quiet, but they carried, and the air between them shimmered not with heat, but with purpose. Somewhere within that swelling host, a young soldier carved the name Gothmog into the handle of his blade, not out of reverence, but to remember what must be faced, what must be ended. And across the growing dark, the lieutenant of Angband walked forward. His footfalls left no ash, not yet, but the world bent around each one, as if bracing for the shape of flame it already remembered. The plain of Dagorlad was not made for beauty. It stretched wide and colorless, a basin where the weight of time seemed to settle like dust. Before the war it had been a place of marshes and gray grasses, silent save for wind. But now it bristled with resolve. The last alliance had made its camp here, and their banners rose not in defiance, but in mourning. They did not gather to conquer, they gathered to remember what must not fall. Gothmog reached the plain's edge before the first clash of arms. He stood upon a ridge of scorched stone and looked across the sea of tents, the silver glint of armor, the shimmer of campfires holding back the dusk. It was not the numbers that held his gaze. It was the stillness. There was no panic among them, no fleeing. The elves moved with quiet coordination, the men with grim determination. Together, they formed a rhythm he had not heard in ages, a rhythm not of survival but of intent. He stepped down. Each footfall burned slightly, but the grass no longer withered instantly. This land was already half-hardened by war, as though it had prepared for him long before his coming. He brought with him the full weight of Angvan's host, but he did not rush them forward. Fire is never foolish. It waits. Siege lines were drawn not with walls, but with silence. Neither side called for parley. Neither side boasted. It was a siege of presence, of patience stretched thin over sharpened days. For weeks they stood like this, shadow pressing against light, hope against memory, and in that breathless interval, something deeper stirred. The Alliance built trenches, raised palisades, wove magic into their perimeters. Their blades were sharpened not just with steel, but with song, and it was said that when the wind passed over them at night, the swords themselves whispered the names of the dead. Even the dwarves, though fewer in number, carved runes into the very stones, anchoring the camp with resilience older than flame. And yet Gothmog did not strike. He moved along the perimeter, inspecting the preparations of his own legions. Trolls chained in rows, catapults buried beneath bone scaffolds. Balrogs brooding in the dim hollows of broken hills. He did not speak, but all felt his presence like a rising heat before dawn. His will did not need to be uttered. It moved through them like gravity. Then came the night when the stars vanished. Not from cloud, but from some deeper occlusion, as if the heavens themselves turned away. In that darkness, Morgoth's command moved through the lines, silent and vast. The siege would begin not with assault, but with isolation, starvation, dread, the slow burning of morale. But it failed. The Alliance did not wither. Their fires remained lit, their guards held vigil, and in the second month of siege, a strange thing occurred. A column of elven archers marched out, not in retreat, but to plant a banner in no man's land. They did not speak, they simply stood it into the earth and returned. The banner bore a single glyph, not of defiance, but of endurance. A tree untouched by flame. A symbol not of victory, but of the refusal to be unmade. Gothmog saw it from afar, and did not approach. He understood what it meant, not to his enemies, but to him. It was an answer, not to his fire, but to the void behind it. That there existed a thing even flame could not undo: memory. The next evening, his Balrogs moved, not as a horde, but as shadows. They struck at the eastern flanks, testing the lines, burning through sentries and melting barricades. But the Alliance did not break. Their response was measured, coordinated. It was as if they had already accepted the pain, already accounted for it, and refused to shift. Even Sauron grew restless, urging greater strikes, deeper incursions. But Gothmog held back, for he saw now that this was not a battle of attrition, it was a battle of meaning, and to strike blindly would be to prove nothing. Instead, he watched, studied, walked alone through the charred furrows his armies had made, and listened to the silence. He waited, not for weakness, but for clarity, for the shape of the confrontation that must come. And beyond the siege lines, Elendil sharpened his sword by firelight, and Gil-galad whispered to his captains of a moment not yet written. Both knew Gothmog was near. They felt him in the way the ground tightened beneath their steps. The siege had begun, but the war had not. It began without trumpet or cry. No horns were sounded when the first fires leapt beyond the siege line. The war started not with a charge, but with a motion, a single ripple across the plain of Dagorlad, as if the earth itself exhaled, and from that breath flame followed. Gothmog stepped forward, not as a symbol, but as an answer. His armor did not shine. It glowed faintly from within, as if forged from the memory of stars that had long since burned out. His whip uncoiled at his side, not crackling, not threatening, only present like a truth that could no longer be ignored. The armies behind him surged, though they made no sound he did not allow. Orcs in layered ranks, trolls burdened with siege towers on their backs, and Balrogs distant and terrible, forming a crescent of fire behind their captain. They moved with restraint, for now, across the field, the alliance had already formed. Elves with bows that gleamed with runes of starlight, men bearing shields etched with names, dwarves few in number, but anchored in defiance, and at their heart 2 figures, Gil-galad, high and silver-crowned, and Elendil, whose gaze held the gravity of a world that would not kneel. They did not blink as Gothmog advanced. They watched him as one watches a storm already overhead. Then the battle opened. The first arc of fire was not a strike, it was a curtain, drawn across the battlefield to sever vision from reason. Through it came the front ranks of Angban's horde, crashing like waves, but moving with precision. This was not the reckless surge of desperate armies. This was crafted destruction, choreographed chaos. Gothmog did not rush to meet the kings. He moved through the field with exact intention, eliminating command posts, silencing captains with a single blow, disrupting the rhythms of the enemy. Everywhere he passed, the ground was left scorched, but not destroyed. He was carving space not to end the war in a moment, but to shape it into something inevitable. The alliance responded in kind. Elves shifted position with uncanny speed, reforming lines before they could break. Men covered the flanks, anchoring gaps with grit and shield. Dwarves dug trenches mid-battle, laying traps that turned fire against itself. Gothmog reached the inner line on the 3rd day. The sky above was black, not with cloud, but with ash and memory. And there in the churned mud and broken armor, he found the one he had marked, Elendil. They met with no words. The air round them thickened, time seeming to tighten. Gothmog struck first, his whip hissing through the air, radiant and terrible. Elendil blocked, not by strength alone, but by rhythm. He had studied this dance long before it began. Steel met flame, flesh met myth. Each blow that Gothmog delivered was perfect, calculated. His movement was not anger, it was balance. Each swing was the fulfillment of a promise made ages ago that fire would find all things, even the strong. But Elendil did not falter. He met that promise with one of his own. That memory, when carried by enough hands, could outlast even fire. Gil-galad arrived like starlight at the edge of dusk. He joined without hesitation, his blade humming with old songs. Together, the 2 kings became a rhythm Gothmog had never faced before. Not resistance, but refusal. They did not fight to win. They fought to hold, and hold they did. Still, Gothmog pressed. His armor cracked, his flame dimmed at the edges, but he did not fall back. Then came the break. A sword, Elendil's, met his side. Not deep, but true. It did not wound the flesh, it struck the memory, and for a moment Gothmog staggered, not from pain, but from what returned. Ecthelion, Fingon, Dwarfen. He saw them again, not their faces, but the weight they had left. Not judgment, not mercy, only presence. He struck back with fire that blinded. Elendil stumbled, but did not yield. Gil-galad seized the moment, and the 3 became locked, not in chaos, but in consequence. The field around them blurred. Orcs screamed, elves burned. But here, time slowed. And then, as flame rose high enough to silence even song, Gothmog felt it. The beginning of his end. Not in defeat, not in blame, in understanding. He would fall not because he was outmatched, but because the world had learned how to bear him. And in that moment, as he raised his arm once more, the fire no longer led. It followed. The fire broke, but not with a scream. It faltered, just slightly, like a breath taken too late. In that moment, as Gothmog staggered between Elendil and Gil-galad, the world around him seemed to shift, not in space, but in meaning. The battlefield became quieter, not by silence, but by clarity. Time had not slowed, only his place in it had. Gothmog had known many wounds, had suffered the heat of counterspell, the sting of star-wrought steel, the rupture of will under siege. But never before had he felt this weight, not of defeat, but of recognition. He had become too large, too visible. The fear he once embodied had been understood, met, and named. The war did not stop for him. Orcs screamed and charged. Elves loosed arrows in sweeping arcs of light. Siege towers collapsed. The cries of the wounded mixed with the clash of iron and the shudder of mountains. But Gothmog no longer moved as a storm. He turned inward briefly, tracing the rhythm of his own flame. It no longer surged, it pulsed, like something listening for its own heartbeat. Across the plain, the tide was turning. The alliance, battered but steady, began to press forward. Their unity was not loud. It was solid, forged in the patient fires of loss and memory. And as they advanced, they carried with them not victory, but inevitability. Gothmog saw it, not just in their blades or their armor, but in their gaze. No hatred, no panic, only resolve. It was the same look Fingon had worn, the same carried by the nameless captain on Dorthonian's ridge. And now it had multiplied. He lifted his whip once more, not in desperation, but in necessity. It cracked through the air like a final chord, one last act to hold the tide. Flames curled upward, spiraling into the sky, a tower of heat meant to blind and divide. It worked. For a moment the lines of the alliance split, and into that space he stepped, not fleeing, advancing, toward Gil-galad. They met without ceremony. The Elf King moved like flowing water, each strike a memory sharpened into form. Gothmog countered with calculated power, his blows heavy, ancient, echoing the rhythm of the world before light. Steel met fire. Again, but Gil-galad did not fall. He endured, and Elendil returned, shoulder bruised, blade raised once more. Together they circled Gothmog like stars around gravity, unrelenting, close, orbiting a center of flame that no longer blazed with certainty. Then came the moment. It did not announce itself. Elendil fainted left. Gil-galad drew Gothmog's focus upward, and into the narrowing space between them. The King of Men drove his sword, not deeply, not fatally, but precisely, through the joint of armor beneath Gothmog's shoulder. It did not end him, but it broke his stance. Gothmog reeled. He turned to strike, but his whip caught on the haft of a fallen banner, snagging for half a heartbeat. That was enough. Gil-galad pressed. His blade sang. Sparks leapt, and Gothmog, for the first time in an age, stepped back. It was not fear, it was understanding. The fire could not win this war. Not alone, not now. He raised his gaze to the darkened sky, saw the moon dimmed by ash, but still whole, and in that dimness something final settled. He struck again once, an arc of flame that scorched the battlefield, forcing Gil-galad and Elendil to retreat a step. It was not attack, it was farewell. Then Gothmog turned, slowly, and began to walk, not back to Angband, not toward retreat, toward the heart of the fire, toward Barad-dûr. The command had shifted. The war was no longer his to shape, and he knew it. The alliance did not pursue. Not immediately. The field was littered with ash and ruin, but also with light, for they had seen him falter, and in that faltering they had felt the beginning of an end. Gothmog's fire still burned, but it no longer led. It followed. Barad-dûr loomed ahead like a thought that could not be unthought. Its towers did not rise, they pierced. Its gates were not opened, they endured, and toward it Gothmog walked alone. The plain behind him still shook with the echo of war, but he did not turn back. The last alliance had not pursued, not out of mercy, but because they knew what remained ahead was not battle. It was reckoning. The fires in him had quieted, not extinguished, never that, but reduced to their essential heat. He no longer burned for glory, nor for dominion. He burned because there was nothing else left to do. Every step was measured not in distance, but in memory. He felt the weight of each fallen foe, Ecthelion, Fingon, the unnamed, the defiant. Their defiance had not defeated him. It had formed him. He crossed the last ridge before the Black Tower, and stood still. No guard challenged him. No gate closed before him. Barad-dûr was not a place that needed to keep others out. It was a place that drew things in, like fire draws breath. Inside, the air was colder than he remembered. Not from lack of heat, but from the absence of flame that meant something. The corridors twisted in familiar patterns, stone and shadow, iron and silence. He moved through them without urgency. No one walked beside him. The other captains were elsewhere. Sauron had taken command. Morgoth, though still bound to the deep dark, had grown distant, like a weight forgotten beneath a sealed tomb. He entered the war chamber and saw no map, no orders pinned to the wall, no list of names, no scroll of intent, just a void, and in it Sauron, tall, cloaked, faceless, except for the light that moved behind the mask. He did not greet Gothmog. He did not rise. He simply gestured to the center of the room, where a single object hovered above a ring of black iron. A sword, new forged, still smoking. Gothmog stepped forward and studied it. It was not made for him. It was a weapon for someone else, someone who would soon be raised to meet the flame that once broke mountains. He understood at once what it meant. Sauron was not building another army. He was building a future, and in that future there would be no place for Gothmog. Not because he was weak, but because he was too known, too large. The world had found its way around him. The last alliance had shown it. Their strength had not been to defeat him in open war. Their strength had been in surviving him, enduring him, outlasting the terror he embodied until it became memory. He turned from the sword. Sauron remained silent. There was nothing to say. Outside, the wind picked up, dry and restless. The plain of Gorgoroth stretched flat and dead to the horizon, but the horizon was changing. It bore the shape of an army not broken by loss, but shaped by it. The alliance had not crumbled. It advanced, slowly, unshaken. Gothmog left the chamber and climbed the outer battlement. From its edge, he could see the path they would take, through the Dagorlad, across the Aesenmoth, to the base of this tower, and he knew, without being told, that he would not meet them at the gate. This was no longer his fire to carry. He had been the edge of wrath, the hand of ruin. But wrath ages, and ruin, once it becomes familiar, no longer frightens. The world had seen his flame and survived it. That was the truth he carried now. He descended one final time into the deepest furnace below Barad-dûr, the place where weapons were born, not of steel, but of will. The forge was still lit, though barely. No workers, no smiths, only heat breathing in the dark. There, without command, without witness, Gothmog placed his whip upon the anvil. The metal hissed, not from pain, but from rest. He did not unmake it. He simply left it. And in that gesture, something ancient ended, not with a fall, not with a cry, but with understanding. He stepped back into the corridor and vanished into shadow. Not to flee, not to hide, to become what fire becomes when its purpose is done. A silence that waits in the walls, a warmth that never forgets, a memory that walks unseen through every tale told after. The fires of war dimmed, but the ground still trembled beneath memory. Barad-dûr stood quiet, a tower not of victory but of waiting, casting its long shadow across plains emptied of song. Behind it, the land of Mordor curled inward like a hand without purpose. Ahead, the last alliance approached, not in haste, not in triumph, but in silence. For though the battles had been won, the shape of their cost had not yet been measured. Gothmog was not seen again. His form did not rise to meet the final charge. His flame did not lash across the fields as it once had. No one knew where he had gone, only that he had gone willingly, not by force, not by blade. He had walked away from the war before it could decide him. And so, when the gates of Mordor shattered and Sauron stood alone atop the ramparts, it was not Gothmog who flanked him, but absence. The elves and men did not speak of the Balrog in their songs of victory. They had no need to. His story was not theirs to finish. What they remembered was the shape he had once cast over the world, and how it had slowly faded, not because it had been slain, but because they had endured long enough to move past it. But deep beneath stone and ash, beneath the ruin of the world that had once housed the will of fire, something older remained. Not a body, not a soul, a presence, quiet and folded upon itself, like an ember that does not burn, but waits. For fire, when denied its place in history, does not vanish. It becomes part of the walls, the soil, the story beneath the story. And so it was that in the years that followed, whispers lingered, not of Gothmog's defeat, but of his silence. Children born after the war would speak his name only once, in tales told by hearthlight, where grown men would shake their heads and say it was finished. But they would not say it twice. The captains of the alliance moved on. Cities were rebuilt, towers were raised in memory of the fallen, and in the great halls of kings, statues were carved, of Gil-galad, of Elendil, of those who had stood against darkness and did not bend. But none were made for Gothmog. His legacy lived not in stone, but in the knowledge that fire had once walked beside ruin, and that it had known when to stop. Some say he was unmade, that in placing down his weapon he unraveled the purpose for which he was formed. Others claim he wanders still, deep beneath the roots of mountains, where flame licks cold stone and waits for a world unguarded. There are those who believe he was never a creature of flesh at all, but an idea given form, a punishment of the Valar given purpose by Melkor's will. And when the will broke, the shape faded. The truth, as always, is quieter. One day, long after the war, a traveler passing through the ruins of the north claimed to have seen a figure upon a ridge, not cloaked in fire, not armored in iron, but tall, still, and watching the horizon. He said the figure did not move, only stood like something remembering itself. When the traveler returned the next day, there were no footprints, only a stone, blackened and worn, resting where no fire had touched in an age. That was the last telling, and yet the world changed in his absence. Fear, once shaped by his presence, became something else, something measured not in screams but in choices. The children of those who fought no longer feared the dark in the same way. They had seen what lay at its center, and they had endured it. And that, more than any blade, was what finally undid Gothmog's fire. For in the end he was not defeated by might. He was not brought low by kings or caught in spell. He was met by a world that no longer burned when he passed. A world that had grown used to flame and no longer fed it with fear. This was his ending. Not a fall, not a cry, but a fading, a soft withdrawal into the bones of the world, where his legacy would hum, barely heard for as long as fire remained in the memory of stone. And when the stars returned to the skies above Mordor, distant and clear, they found no shadow tall enough to challenge them. Only the wind brushing over a land once broken, now beginning again.